Okay, so a lot of people, a lot of survivors of narcissistic relationships, you have felt at times or were told that you're too much or you can't cope or we're called intense or we're called angry. All these things come up all the time. So I'm going to share with you a story, okay? This is about a woman who experienced narcissistic relationships throughout her lifespan, okay? Had one narcissistic parent, one parent who could be loving but was so lost in trying to appease the narcissistic parent that she experienced it as, let's call it abandonment, right? But it wouldn't be until adulthood that she would understand that, right? She recalled being so protective of that healthier parent that idealizing that parent was part of how she managed all of it, right? Years later, she had to integrate the multiple truths that she had a loving parent who suffered from the narcissistic abuse, and in having to appease the narcissistic co-parent, the loving parent simply was not available, okay? Obviously, because this woman is now older, nobody talked about this being a narcissistic family system, right? And in fact, the narcissistic parent was often heralded as a family hero for all they did for everyone else in the family. They actually did do a lot for other people in the family. The child, when they were, this person an adult now, when they were a child, they simultaneously idealized and feared that narcissistic parent. So messy doesn't even begin to describe the situation, and I'm sure many of you have similar situations. So as a child, this woman recalls that she was super smart, she was empathic, she was perceptive, she was gentle, she was introspective, but she never felt fully safe. She could not have articulated it then. She understands that now. She also looks back and would recognize that from time to time, wasn't frequent, but from time to time, she does remember this very well, that she'd get very angry, very upset, and have what she described as meltdowns, like big tantrums. And she said she could count on one hand the number of times it happened. She said by and large, she was a very overregulated and overcontrolled child, and I could see that she was a very overregulated adult. But every so often she would get really mad. And a couple of times, those small number of times, it happened in school, and she got in trouble in school for doing this. And even her parents at times would call her intense, and she was angry, right? And it became a sort of family joke. But really, and I've spent enough time with this woman to say, this is not an angry person, not an angry person by nature at all. As she got older and she went into adolescence and then young adulthood, she remembered, she's recalled, like she felt that anger inside of her. And she said it would sometimes bubble up that she'd say like kind of mean things about peers at school. Not often, but she would sometimes just feel angry about other people or about those relationships. And again, she would sometimes have those angry outbursts and sort of say angry things. And while she was largely valued as a disciplined high school, she was a good student in high school, the family maintained the narrative of her as this intense person. That's a word she kept using, intense. This followed her into adulthood, though it started coming out more in adulthood, as she described it as more as anxiety. She said she still would make some of those little kind of salty comments, and there was always this kind of brewing anger in her that she was never able to put a name to. But most of the time, she said she wasn't walking around the world as an angry person. She was warm. She was empathic. She never behaved in an entitled way. She had lots of friends. The reputation stuck of her being this intense person. She started to unpack it in therapy. And she began to realize that this was never anger or even intensity. It was a sort of natural kind of lashing out at the narcissistic abuse. These eruptions of anger that would come up in the midst of what were largely her fawning responses, freezing responses, submitting responses to what was happening around her. It wasn't until she was, again, well into adulthood, like after even her kids grew up, that she even began to understand it. And in her adulthood, she had experienced some narcissistic relationship and married to a narcissistic person and gotten divorced and had a narcissistic partner that she almost married, blah, blah, blah. With friends at work, she'd had worked with a narcissistic person, blah, blah, blah. But she never labeled it as such. And in those relationships, she was sometimes considered to be a bit of a malcontent. And she was frustrated because she was actually really good at containing herself, even when something was really unfair or unkind or empathic happened to her. But every so often, and she just couldn't contain it. And she then started to buy into this narrative that she's an intense, like an angrily intense person. So to offset that, she would really try to be kind to people. And this part wasn't fawning because she was actively doing it, right? She didn't want this narrative of her being an intense and demanding and difficult person to be sustained. So she would try harder and harder to push down her feelings, sometimes to the demise of her own health. In fact, in one of her cases, she stayed completely silent about a health problem because she was trying to be so stoic, and because she didn't want to be perceived as dramatic. She ended up in the hospital because she passed out in public one day, and it turned out she had developed a really severe kidney infection. So that pushing it down was actually to her demise. Now listen, if someone rolled up and laid it out for her, oh, this parent of yours and then friend of yours and partner of yours are narcissistic, they're never going to listen to you, they're never going to have empathy for you or take any accountability for their behavior, it would be painful to hear that. But you would not get lost in the hopeless struggle of trying not to react to anything, right? Which is what she was doing, and she didn't understand why. And the challenge was that about 95% of the time, this woman did not react at all. I've talked about this theme in other videos with other people too, ever. She kept very calm. And the tough part, as everyone knows from narcissistic relationships, is that the bad behavior often happens behind closed doors in quiet, subtle ways that sort of devastate you, but that others can't see. They don't see someone yelling at you, or in some cases even hitting you, because that may not be happening. But instead, what is happening is sort of the death by 1,000 cuts of these relationships, the dozens of daily digs and fails, the unwillingness to carry their half of things, to get testy with you if you ask for even the smallest amount of help. You become a one-person show, and you tell yourself things like, oh, I just have an avoidant personality style because I just have to do everything by myself. I don't know that you have an avoidant personality style. If you don't do it, it ain't going to get done. And then sometimes you react. And that's when you'll get called intense or reactive or angry. So when this woman was in couples therapy, she initially did feel safe. She felt that, okay, now there's a referee in the room. So if my husband gets rageful or reactive, then I have someone in the room who will see it and maybe tell me that I'm not crazy. But then when the husband did get pissed that the therapist wasn't always seeing his way and always taking his side, he would get testy. And then the woman would say, do you see what he's doing? In that kind of an intense voice, as though finally someone else was there to see what was happening. And she thought she'd no longer feel crazy. But then the therapist said, whoo, that's intense. She literally used that word intense and said, you need to turn that down. Instead of pointing out the unkindness of the husband's words. And she then said, well, maybe your husband's reacting because you're intense. So, and the woman never, she didn't really behave like that at home. So the woman felt completely defeated by this. And her experience is not unique. And this can happen in couples therapy, with family members, and in friend groups. But this persistence is that the person in the relationship is intense when somebody finally sees it and you're like, do you see? And people call that intense. So what's the answer? It really depends on whether you can disconnect from the relationship or not. Some of it comes down to, honestly, to self-compassion. The world really, as a whole, still does not understand these relationships. And maybe I think it's more accurate to say the world doesn't want to understand these relationships. And to be kind to ourselves when we have what is still a very well-controlled reaction to what are very, very manipulative and unkind circumstances, to help people understand what is being done to them instead of simply judging their reactions, because that's what we tend to do. We judge their reactions instead of explaining what's going on. I'm not sure why we are so willing to let the narcissistic people get away with their rage or painstakingly explain it to them. But when a person reacts to a narcissistic person's anger or insults or manipulation, we tend to call the person reacting to them intense. I mean, honestly, it's a mystery to me. I keep trying to educate, but frankly, folks, I face more resistance than not about this. And I have a video coming about that soon, because the resistance to this is actually growing. That woman's story resonated so deeply with me for such a long time, because for years, and probably to this day, still to this day, I really felt it, because I've been called intense too. You're too much, you're too extra, RAMANI, you're too intense. And I took it on as my identity, but really I'm not. I'm not that intense. I care about things, I have empathy, I fight for the underdog, but I actually grew up in a way that reactions were simply not allowed. And I grew up at a time when school reactions were not allowed, so you just couldn't do those things. And I think I would have wanted the earth to swallow me up if a teacher got mad at me, right? So I've always had relationships where reactions were not allowed, and if I had one, I would be called intense and crazy. So I've kept quiet about some really horrible things that have happened to me so I wouldn't take up too much space. But were there times that I'd react? Sure. And I see now that people don't see the rest of the iceberg. That they often see us, and saw me, as I was making a kerfuffle about an ice cube and not an iceberg. It took me a lot more therapy than I care to admit to let go of that sense that I was intense and recognize that for the world to feel good about narcissistic folks, it's easier to call me and that woman and most people going through these relationships intense. That's a gaslight. I get it now, but damn. And I see this happen to people every single day. Healing, like I said, there's sort of that final stop on that healing train is individuation, meaning, and purpose. And part of that is knowing ourselves. Is reacting one time after not reacting most of the time a bad thing? Or is it better to never react? Listen, I like a little bit of genuine reaction to numbness, but sadly, I think the world would rather that most people in these relationships just put up and shut up. I'm going to tell you now, though, don't do it. The world may prefer it, but in the long run, it's not good for you. And it may be that the world throws a label on you that is not your label, and you recognize it for the gaslight that it is. The key is to not let it seep into your identity. Thanks again.